This is our Introduction to Tax Justice webinar, which takes place during Fair Tax Week, which is something that we at the Just Money movement do each year around this time as a moment in our calendar to help churches to engage with the subject of tax justice. So this session tonight is going to be a really useful introduction to that subject. We're also on the eve of the Chancellor Rachel Reeves's spending review statement to Parliament tomorrow, and there'll be a little bit of reflection on the political context later. And just to say as a word of welcome for those who may not be familiar with us at Just Money Movement, we've got our vision statement here on the screen on this slide that I've shared. We are Christians working for a world where banks, businesses, and the tax system help to shape a fairer, greener future. And we work across the churches to help them engage with issues of economic justice, including around the area of tax, which is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. So we will start with a little bit of theology, a little bit of Christian reflection, which I hope will be interesting and enlightening to you all. If you're not familiar with that, then I hope that's still accessible and interesting to you. And there'll be stuff later on in the session as well, if you're interested in the policy detail too. So just to show us where we're going for the course of this session. Our first section will be from our fantastic Just Money Movement trustee, Sue, who will be talking to us about theology. Why should Christians care about tax justice? Then we'll have a section on policy. How could tax policy be more just? With Jake Atkinson from Tax Justice UK. Then we'll have a reflection on politics. So what's the context of this Labour Party and what opportunities might there be for influencing them, with Hannah, the Director of Christians on the left. And we'll finish with a reflection on activism. What can I do? What might you do after this session tonight with one of our Just Money Champions and long-term supporters, David Haslam. After which we'll have about 15 minutes for Q&A. And as I said, feel free to be sending your questions in via the chat function as we go, but also we'll have the chance to unmute and ask the questions live if you want to at that point. But for now, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Sue to speak to us about the Christian case for tax justice. And whilst I introduce you, Sue, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Annie to share Sue's slides. So we'll just take a moment for that to get ready.
Thanks, Matt.
How are you doing, Sue?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful evening here in Ashby-de-la-Zouch. Okay, so a little while ago, I saw a Facebook post expressing the wish that we could live as we did 100 years ago, with no taxes and a sense of community spirit. Well, I had to disagree, not so much with the community spirit, which I'm sure you'll see that I support, but with the idea that taxes were only introduced within the last 100 years, because records of taxation go back actually thousands of years. They probably form part of some of the earliest public notations that we have. They're part of the structure of our life. They have both a history and a current story, a narrative that often expresses and shapes how people feel about them. Next slide, please. And so one of the questions I wanted to ask was, and I know I've got an audience, but I can't see you, but if you wanted to contribute the sort of things that you heard said about tax in the public sphere, what kind of comments would they be? If you want to shout out, Matt, can you make that possible for the group? Just very briefly.
Let's embrace the chaos. If you want to unmute yourself and contribute, go for it. If you want to type it in the chat, please do that as well. Maybe I'll read them out.
I think it's what affects me as an individual.
Thank you.
A lot about.
Yeah.
I think people can be quite negative about it as if it's a bad thing, or they wish they didn't have to have money removed from their salary or income.
Exactly, thanks. Too easily avoided by the super rich, Robert has said. Well, I put some things in this slide that I thought you might recognize. Oh, no, Annie, you've got to do it, haven't you? Sorry, because I haven't got the control here, so I'm sorry, that's it. And you mentioned some of them. Tax is a burden. It is taking what is justifiably mine, and I have a responsibility to avoid paying it as much as I can. And then if I do pay it, I often don't trust my government to spend it well. And if you could hold on, and you're going to have to press twice for the next slide, so I'll give you a cue. Now, we've got a colleague here from the Tax Justice Network with whom we work closely, and they work primarily in the secular world. And in that world, tax can be seen as a very useful tool for mobilizing resources that we can spend on governance, essential services that we enjoy, assistance for the vulnerable, culture, sport, and even for charitable giving here and abroad. And it's a useful mechanism for addressing inequality within society and for encouraging participation in the democratic process. No taxation without representation has been the rallying cry for protests over many centuries. But just at this moment, we're thinking about how those responses to tax on that slide provoke us as people of faith to ask questions about the fundamental values that we espouse with regards to our Creator and the rest of creation. And by our reflection on those things, we can perhaps then start to discern how our faith might inspire and mobilize our attitude and our action on tax. So Annie, if you move me on, you might have to do 2, I think. Okay, so I just put together here some stories from the Bible that we might recall if we turn to our scriptures for thoughts about tax. And there's only a handful here. That story about Jesus being tested by the Pharisees and the scribes about the whole policy of paying tax to Rome, the coin that was found in the fish's mouth so that Jesus could pay tax. In the Old Testament, the prophet Samuel's warning to the Israelites who wanted a king to be appointed over them, that this king would tax and it wouldn't be a good experience. And then finally, the very well-known story about Jesus going to dinner with a tax collector and him having a change of heart as a result, perhaps, of hosting Jesus simply to eat. Now, what we can see here from these brief examples is that taxes were familiar to people in both Testament times, and they were very often linked in people's minds with extraction and oppression, especially in the minds of the poor, who might bear the burden of them. We've had that word before, because there was no representation for them, and there was no spending from those taxes on community well-being. Taxes played a key role in an economy of extraction under the Roman Empire. On again, Annie, please. Now, the debate about tax, the conversation about tax, if we want to get less controversial, is often framed in terms of they want to take our money to spend on them. And the pronouns are doing quite a lot of heavy lifting there. And so we might ask, well, who do we mean by they? And usually we mean governments. Who are them? Well, generally people who are undeserving. Certainly not us, because we don't mind taxes being spent on us and our things. And what is ours? Well, the public message is very protective of individuals and their earnings, their private wealth, and their asset ownership. But a fundamental question for us is, Annie, who ultimately owns the resources that are harvested from our world and on which the well-being of its people depend? Now, as people of faith, we would have to answer, God does. As creator of all that there is, sustainer of all that there is, and the ultimate generous giver to his creation of everything that makes for life for us. And this was the point that Jesus was trying to draw his interrogators towards in that controversy about paying tax to Caesar, when he asked them to show him the means by which they would pay the tax they were hoping that he would comment on. And they had a coin with the emperor's image on it in their possession. Now, as good Jews, they would have prayed in thankfulness every morning to God, giver and sustainer. They knew that all came from God, and that all that was offered back to God was actually God's to begin with. Caesar's world was encompassed within God's world, not an entity existing alongside it about which a decision could be made about allegiance. And the challenge was to know how to live in that material and historical world while being faithful to the conviction that all belongs to God. And this was a dilemma in Jesus' time, and it continues as a dilemma for us today, demanding awareness from us of the reality of the economy we live in and a willingness to subject what we see to the criteria of our faith. So if I was to ask you to look in your pockets now, we would find that our money too, whatever form it takes, bears the likeness of the system that produces it and within which we live. And we have to ask, well, how do we juggle our allegiance? Because when we look, what we are seeing in our world is an increasing polarization of our society, with enormous wealth being acquired by the top 1%, and within that percentage, a distancing in levels of wealth between the 0.1% and the rest. The richest 10% in our globe own 3/4 of the world's wealth, and their share is increasing. Next slide, please, Annie. And again, and again, and again, and again. And so Oxfam is telling us that for every $1 of new global wealth earned by a person in the bottom 90%, each billionaire in the world gains roughly £1.4 million, $1.7 million. And again, Annie, please. And we can see that even UK billionaires saw their collective wealth increase in 2024 by £35 million a day, to a total of 182 billion. Now that shows us, those arrows going up to the top of that pyramid, that we are living in an extractive economy. In Egypt, enslaved Hebrews lived and worked inside such an economy, with Pharaoh declaring that even the Nile is mine. Their liberation from it and the process of journeying to a different place taught them some fundamental lessons they needed to follow if the society that they were going to create in their new life was not to mimic the one that they had left. And out in the wilderness, they experienced the faithful providence of their liberator through the daily supply of the food they needed. And from trying to hoard it, they learned the importance of enough. In their promised land, they built social structures centered around obedience to the God who'd liberated them and a commitment to neighbor. And this involved a system of neighborly respect and provision with regard to land and crops and livestock, and then some basic support to those who, for whatever reason, lacked land, lacked animals, and so could not sustain themselves. And this was done in two ways, through prohibition and then command. So there was prohibition of complete extraction, clearing your fields at harvest right to the edges. Leaving the edges unharvested meant the poor could come in and glean for themselves. And it was prohibited to penalize the already vulnerable by insisting, for instance, that you took the elements of their livelihood and their safety, like their cloak, as a pledge for any debt they owed you. And then a command to offer up a proportion for communal use of whatever individuals and families had acquired from their own harvest. Thanks, Annie. And there's lots of clicking here, I'm afraid. So, tax is a form of harvest, in my view. And for me, it's resonant with, if it's not exactly the same as, the payment of tithes, which was embedded in the regular functioning of that society, which the freed Hebrews established in their promised land. The purpose of the tithes was to support those without the means to support themselves, but who nevertheless were serving the community. That was the Levites. And to provide the wherewithal to stage a celebration for all the people, even those without assets and without income, and then to offer welfare to the poor. Annie, could you press probably 6 times, I would think, to get the next lot up? Yeah. And again, thank you. And if you could just hold it there. And so you can see that what I've put on that screen are extractions from those various books of the Old Testament, from Numbers, and there is the provision for the Levites, the celebration in the middle, where people are supposed to come all together with their maidservants and their bondservants and even the people who had nothing in order to eat the harvest together and to share it amongst each other. And then at the end of every 3 years, bring that contribution to sustaining the very poor. Now, just as the policies of our tax allies offer us tools that can help to develop policies in our nation to address inequality and poverty, so the fundamentals of Scripture, like this and what we see in the New Testament, offer us, people of faith standards, to critique the situation we live in and the proposals to change it. And so we should ask, are there then specific ways in which our economy is disproportionately penalizing those who are at the bottom of the pyramid? Are there specific ways in which our economy is encouraging the exponential growth of wealth amongst our national and global citizens? And we should question this narrative that is everywhere about worth and entitlement as an explanation for inequality. And why should we? Well, because if we want to be faithful to God, we have to be faithful to our neighbor. If we want to be people who can say we love God, we need to love our neighbor. And that love needs to be expressed in practical actions and not merely our words. And taxation is essential for practical action in our economy because we no longer live in simple communities where need is obvious and our neighbor is familiar. Our public narrative about tax is generally not positive. Words like burden are widely used. A reference to tax justice is often interpreted as a reduction of the tax burden, allowing people to keep more or all of what they feel is theirs. There are strong feelings of, well, this is mine, which we need to address. And that strong feeling of ownership goes right through whether we earn our wealth and our income or whether we inherit it. We can't be reminded too often as citizens that we all benefit from public spending. And apart from the services that we can easily see, like health and education, and the material of our lives, the roads, the hospitals, the schools, we're also surrounded by structures, the sort of structures that freed Hebrews knew were important. Structures to preserve and increase our safety and prosperity, the justice system, which gives us contract law, property registration, then there's employment regulation and health and safety legislation, so that we can all maintain our livelihoods and make our consumption safe. We also, it seems to me, cannot be reminded too often as believers that this demand to contribute to communal well-being through tax in our current time, rather than a set festival, because we no longer live in a village, but in rather complex societies, is a faith-based instruction and is insisted upon because the practice of neighborly economics, working out what they are and what they look like, protects us from a noticed slippage into the world of acquisition and retention, and it challenges the increasing polarization of those who would benefit from such a world arranged around scarcity and fear from those who suffer from it. So as I finish, I'd just like to plant in your mind some questions. Given what I've shown you from the Old Testament, I would ask you whether you can think of ways in which our current tax system actually hurts the poor and favors the rich, and I'm sure you could. Can you think of equivalent groups like the Levites in our society who need to be supported by communal spending because of the work they do for us, which cannot gain a profit for them as their income? Can you think of instances where our taxes are used to fund communal celebrations, even in this century, perhaps regular cultural or sporting events? Can you think of ways in which we spend our taxes to protect the vulnerable? Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much, Sue. There's a lot that you've given us to think about there. Really, really excellent. I'm now going to invite Jake Atkinson, who is Campaigns and Movement Manager at Tax Justice UK, who are really pushing the way forward with policies for tax justice in this country and as part of Tax Justice Network globally as well. Jake, over to you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, everyone. It's really, really lovely to be with you all. I'm just going to share my screen. Does that all look okay for you? I'm seeing nodding. Okay, fantastic. Well, I will make a start, and I'll just reduce that so I can see some notes. So yes, this I'm going to give kind of a bit of a short overview of what we kind of work on at Tax Justice UK. Tax justice is essential to how our economy is structured and who it works for, and it has been encouraging to see some progress by the Labour government at the last budget, but a lot more can be done. And what I'll do is towards the end, I'll drop a load of links into the chat and some of our resources and things to help. We are in a crisis of inequality in the UK. We are the sixth richest country in the world, but most people wouldn't feel that wealth. That wealth is concentrated in the hands of the very few. There were 15 billionaires, 15 billionaires in 1990. And in this year's Sunday Times Rich List, there are now 156 billionaires. And we have 50 families, the 50 richest families in the UK hold more wealth than 50% of the population. And this is all whilst we have millions of people, particularly millions of children, living in poverty. And income from wealth is taxed far, far, far less than income from work. So what is the solution? You can maybe read it on the banner there from a recent rally outside the Treasury, is that we must, of course, tax extreme wealth. So what does this look like? To have a fair and progressive tax system that benefits everyone. It includes wealth tax, and it includes taxing wealth as much as work, such as raising capital gains tax to the same rate as income tax, closing loopholes, fairly taxing big polluters and corporations, and tackling tax abuse. And we do this crucially so that we can not only tackle inequality, but so we can invest in our communities. So I'll share with you a document that we've developed mapping out 10 tax reforms and closed loopholes that could raise £60 billion in a single year. And that's been developed in partnership with patriotic millionaires. I can kind of skip over this. We've spoken a bit already. Thank you, Sue, for saying that you always hear, about tax being a burden rather than being a contribution and a tool to achieve the type of society we want. And the reason why we talk about taxing extreme wealth and the super rich is that many people, when you hear the word wealth, they think of security, they think of a home, they think of a pension. We know obviously that many people in the UK today can't afford their own home. And obviously we see, the government taking away support and affordable fuel payment as well. Although you may have seen the news very recently this week of some restoration of that. So we don't have time to go into kind of all of our policies. So I'll start with one that you might have heard about, is a 2% wealth tax on net assets over £10 million. So if you had £11 million in wealth, you just pay an extra 20%, £20,000 a year. So it's only on the 2% above that 10 million threshold. And because wealthy people often expect returns on their wealth of about 5 to 10% every year, and many of them would stay very wealthy. Let's assume that we can raise the revenues to invest in public services in our schools and our hospitals. And there are a lot of vested interests who look to attack this policy as unfeasible, or that it would result in people kind of leaving. Because the threshold is at £10 million, it would be far easier to administer than other kind of examples that you may have seen in other countries, because it would only apply to about 20,000 people. That's 0.04% of the population. There are even private members clubs in London whose criteria is for you to have £10 million in wealth in order to join. So and the 24 billion are a small amount actually of behavioural change. So even that 24 billion that would be raised includes even from a few people kind of leaving. But by and large, we know that millionaires actually don't leave because of tax changes, because many of them have family here, their children are in schools here, their businesses and their financial assets are all here. And very much the data shows differently. I think it was 0.01% of the billionaire population relocated when they increased their kind of wealth tax. I think it was just 30 individuals. The lost revenue from them leaving is a fraction of what was actually raised by increasing that. So a lot of reports out there are sensationalized. The other strand of our work is very much on making sure that polluters pay. You know, climate change is currently costing each UK household around £3,000 per year, according to analysis from Global Witness. This comes from the costs of flooding, of global crop losses, the rising insurance bills, rising food bills, and it means that the high costs of essentials are here to stay if action on the climate crisis isn't taken. And this relentless snowballing of prices and costs it continues to hit low-income families the hardest, and yet they are the least responsible for causing climate breakdown. So it's the big polluters who are out there causing the damage, and ultimately they can afford to pay. So it's the giant oil and gas corporations, ultra-rich individuals, and those with private jets and frequent flyers. From UK production alone, international oil firms made £5 billion in profits each year for the last 30 years on average. And the carbon emissions from the world's biggest 25 oil companies caused an estimated 15 trillion worth of damage, economic damage globally from 1985 to 2018. And on the final point now on kind of private jets, they emit 14 times more carbon per passenger than regular flyers. So a disproportionate harm that they are causing. So how do we make them pay, and why? Well, we want to support a fully just transition that reduces inequalities and ensures that no one is left behind, and that advances shared prosperity for all communities, including workers who are currently in those polluting industries, who need to then be supported and trained to work in renewables, and also supporting households on low incomes. So we should also be increasing the UK's contribution to international climate finance to better reflect our global responsibility. And we also want to make polluters pay in order to disincentivize further investment in volatile, expensive oil and gas so that we are delivering that cheap, secure, renewable energy. And finally, we also want to do this because we want to strengthen our public services and improve living standards. Strengthen our economy, but also general kind of responses to crises that from climate change. And we also work on tackling tax abuse. So every year, an estimated £388 billion, that's just shy of $500 billion, that should have been paid in tax disappears into tax havens. And a staggering 26%, just over a quarter, is enabled by Britain and its overseas territories, with places like the British Virgin Islands and Bermuda leading the charge. And actually, one thing I should link is an action that JustMoney did around the Joint Ministerial Council with the overseas territories back in November. So this is something that JustMoney movement have been doing amazing work on by essentially calling for the government to introduce publicly accessible registers of beneficial ownership. And so these are kind of like transparency registers, like a company's house, and they allow watchdogs and investigators and human rights campaigners to go through to see who actually owns an asset. And because a lot of this secrecy and smokescreen and this illicit finance, a lot of the money in these tax havens is used, as I say, dirty money. It's used to fund organized crime. It's also used to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine as well. And finally, we also need a United Nations tax convention. So this is being negotiated currently at the UN, and negotiations will run on until 2027. And this is really important. This was spearheaded by the Africa Group of Nations at the UN, because for too long, global rules around tax have been set by a small handful of the very richest countries in the OECD, primarily European countries, the UK and the US as well. And what this has the power to do is to introduce greater regulation, new tax rules and reforms, such as taxes on wealth, global asset registers that will help track the extreme wealthers out there to crack down on tax avoidance, and also tackle illicit finance as well. So it's really, really important that the UK, who actually voted against the terms of reference at the UN in November of last year, comes around to being an active, positive, constructive supporter throughout these negotiations. And a lot of the UK, the new government have been saying about their position on the international stage is around being a reliable partner working with genuine respect in partnership with countries in the so-called global south, low and middle income countries. Yet they have cut like international aid, life-saving international aid in order rather than. So it's really important that the UK actually takes action on this in order to bring in more global revenues. Lower income countries are disproportionately harmed by tax abuse. It's actually, I think, 5 times higher as a percentage of their country's health budgets. It's 5 times greater in amount lost to tax abuse in high income countries, even though countries like us lose a kind of higher amount in total. So a lot of work needed there. And so a lot of people say, well, what can I do? Well, we all have I know that all of you being on this call are kind of active campaigners and supporters and looking to take action on this agenda. Just Money Movement is a fantastic movement itself, an organisation doing this work. But Tax Justice UK, we work very closely with you, and we have various resources and tools which we can share. So bringing people together to discuss shared goals and values, educating each other about the solutions, like we're doing today, is all really, really, really valuable. But we can also be organising in constituency political parties to pass motions in support of wealth taxation. That can increase pressure on the current government. You can organise in your union or your local community, and you can also receive a newsletter to keep up to date across all these various strands of work. Just kind of gone through a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But we also have on our website an actions page where you can sign our kind of live petitions or contact your MP. But yeah, thank you very much. I will drop a couple of links and things in the chat, which can also be circulated afterwards as well. But I'm really looking forward to hearing your questions, and thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Jake. That was fantastic and a lot of information to take in. I'd like to invite Hannah Rich forward. Hannah is the Director of Christians on the Left. And just before you launch into what you've got to share with us today, Hannah, why don't you tell us about what Christians on the Left is and what you guys do?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt. I haven't got any slides, so you're stuck with this face for the next 10 minutes or so. Christians on the Left, it does what it says on the tin, really. We are a group of Christians on the left of politics. We're affiliated to the Labour Party, and we work in that space of Christians who kind of find themselves on the left of politics, mainly within the Labour Party, but not entirely, trying to kind of speak true to the party and to be the voice of the party to Christians in local churches. So that kind of bridge, I guess, between people of faith and the Labour Party. Very excitingly, the Labour government, that's something I think we're still getting our heads around after quite a while in opposition. It's certainly a joy for me to be the first director in well over a decade to be the director of Christians on the Left in a Labour government, which is a real joy in lots of ways. This time last year, in fact, I was running around like a headless chicken going to 21 different constituencies in the course of the 6-week campaign, which was a whole adventure of itself. But yeah, if you're interested in Christians on the Left and you don't already know about us, go to our website, christiansontheleft.org.uk, and we'd love to have you join if that's something you're interested in.
Great. Well, it's brilliant to have you with us and your, I think, to be fair, fairly unique perspective in terms of where you sit in relation to the Parliamentary Labour Party and the government as a whole. So I know you've got some thoughts to share with us about the current political context, so please take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I should probably start with a caveat that I'm not any sort of government spokesperson. We are affiliated to the party, but we're certainly, when relevant or when appropriate, a critical friend there. We're not not here to just sort of say all the government lines, if you like. But we do have 1 in 9 Labour MPs is one of our members, which I think is a fantastic statistic. And certainly when we come on to activism, maybe I'll leave that to David later on, but when we come to talk about how we can influence that, Jake talked as well about local political parties. 1 in 9 is an incredible political force, if nothing else, and a real way we're encouraging our members to influence their local MPs as well. But I think in terms of tax and tax justice, we're in a really strange, in many ways, a really strange position actually with the government at the moment, at the current kind of political climate, if you like. We all know that the kind of fiscal rules say that there is no money. We've heard that quite often. And yet in some of what Jake's just shared, particularly the wealth tax and the amount of money, the amount of money that could bring in, then, you know, that there is money there. There is plenty of solutions and ways in which, you know, that money could be brought in, and we could have so much more kind of capital, I guess, to play with some of the policies that we would like to see. And yet we're not yet, I say not yet, seeing kind of a move on of the government towards a wealth tax or towards something that could give them more money to spend. I think I have heard in the last kind of little while a kind of interesting shift, I guess, in the argument from a purely kind of ideological against to a kind of the government line, or the line that we're hearing a little bit more from MPs being, oh, tell me where it's worked, tell me a country where it's worked, tell me a formulation of this that has actually brought in the amount of money that you are suggesting it might. I think that is a subtle shift. It's not certainly a kind of wholesale move towards a tax or towards any kind of wealth taxation, but it is a change away from just a like blanket no, to be kind of interested, I guess, at least in the formulation thereof. And I'm not an economist. Jake has done far more of the work than me. I think in Jake's organisation, so much more of that work than us in terms of showing how it could work, how we might implement a wealth tax. As far as I'm concerned, actually, the kind of best time to have brought this in would have been the end of the pandemic, both politically and economically, actually, in terms of the windfall that a lot of the wealthiest people had during that time. I think the political will was there. I think the public support was there. But the second best time would be now, basically. And the support is there. So, you know, there is a wealth of different polling stats that we could point to that show there is overwhelming public support for this. So as unlike many of the things that the governments are kind of talking with, it's not an unpopular thing. It's not a thing, particularly when you hear those stats like 20,000 people, 0.4% of the population would pay some of the formulations of this. It's not unpopular, but actually even, I was just looking at some stats from Patriotic Millionaires who've done some amazing work on this, but they find that 68% of those with over £1 million, so the getting towards the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, would support the introduction of a net wealth tax on those with more than 10 million. They've got all sorts of stats that show that actually even, not universally, but kind of a majority of people that would fit in that camp think this is a good idea. And I think that's really encouraging, because that shows that there is that solidarity there among many of the wealthiest, that recognition that they are the wealthiest, and that actually maybe paying a little bit more in their tax contribution would be a good thing. I think there is still work to do on the kind of political narrative around this, but also the public narrative around tax generally. Sue touched on this already, so did Jake, but there's still, I think, that sense of tax being something negative, or something that you might want to avoid. I find it really interesting, actually, that I get a lot of sort of spam / kind of cold call messages, particularly on LinkedIn. I don't know whether it's because I've got director in my job title, irrespective of the fact that it's director of Christians on the Left, or whether it's my surname maybe kind of factored into the mix there. But I get a lot of like, oh, you might be interested. You're interested in tax. We see you've talked about this. We can help you relocate your company to Dubai to kind of avoid all of that. And, you know, Christians on the Left, we're not going to be moving to Dubai anytime soon. And the amount of money we're talking about is incredibly small and shoestring. We're not a billionaire, multi-millionaire company by any stretch. But there is that, even with the kind of spam messages, even with the kind of the algorithms that fire these out, there is a suggestion that if you're talking about tax, if you're a director, if you're someone of kind of, that level in a company, then obviously when you're talking about tax, it's because you want to fiddle it or you want to avoid it. And I think there is definitely more work to be done. Our Patriots Pay Tax campaign a few years ago, we like to think contributed to that, and the Just Money Thanks for Tax campaign last year, I think did a huge amount of work in shifting that. But there is certainly a little bit way to go on that. And then lastly, I think there's been a lot of focus on a wealth tax and on the political kind of imperative for that, the political implications of that. And I think that is certainly something that we should continue talking about. But I think that tax justice goes broader than that. So Jake's talked about the Making Polluters Pay campaign. That's fantastic. We're supporting that. But I think there is also space to be perhaps a little bit more creative in kind of how we think about taxation, not in terms of how we avoid it, but in terms of how we find those solutions with that. I was really struck quite recently, Gordon Brown went on record to say that he kind of thought we should end the 2-child limit on benefits and end child poverty that way by taxing online casinos, by bringing in a new tax on online gambling. And I think that was a really pragmatic policy, because he was, not just presenting the problem, but also the solution. And I think that particularly in this political climate, this fiscal climate, that is absolutely what we need to be doing. We need to be saying, this is what we want you to do with this money, but here's how we're going to bring it in. But I think actually that wasn't just saying, let's hit the top 1%. That was really specifically saying there's this whole realm of kind of online gambling, online casinos that isn't actually factored into our tax system in a very just way at the moment. And that's something we can do. So I think I'll leave that there for now. There's certainly, I'm sure, questions to come in on the government approach to this, some of which I can answer, some of which, as I say, I'm not Rachel Reeves and I'm not a government spokesperson, and I certainly wouldn't hazard a guess as to what we're going to hear tomorrow. But I think there's encouraging signs, and there's certainly work that we can do and should be doing around tax justice, even in the current climate.
Thanks, Hannah. I really appreciate your thoughts there, and again, acknowledging that you're not a spokesperson for the government, but you've still shared some really interesting stuff with us there. Before we move on to our final section, I think I'm just going to add on the political context that, as I'm sure many of us know, we do have a comprehensive spending review announcement tomorrow from Rachel Reeves to the UK Parliament, which sets the departmental budget for each department of government to the end of this Parliament. And whilst it's not a fiscal event where the Chancellor has the opportunity to raise or lower taxes or change borrowing, it is a moment for us to reflect on the kind of political choices that we have been brought into by virtue of the fiscal rules that the government is committed to. So it's a chance for us to say, whatever the kind of settlement that comes out tomorrow, there are cuts that could have been avoided if the government sought to raise revenue in other places. And it's interesting to me that we kind of have these two framings throughout this session tonight. One is that basically to counter that there is no money narrative, there's money out there that we can use to spend on things that help and benefit the common good. But there's also the fairness side of things as well, that I think Sue and Jake have also brought out things in terms of on whose shoulders do the contributions come from, and how do we create a more equal society as well. So there's two kind of strands for us to be thinking about. But do keep an eye out tomorrow. Just Money Movement will be releasing a statement on the comprehensive spending review. And we also have an easy write to your MP email action on our website, which, Annie, I don't know if you would mind putting the link in the chat. We'll share it again at the end. If you'd like to add your voice to our calls to say cuts can be avoided by raising money from lots of the sources that we've already talked about this evening. But now I want to invite our final speaker up, David Haslam. David is one of our Just Money champions and a long-time campaigner, supporter, activist, many other things. And I've invited David along because we have talked a lot about ideas, about politics, about economics, but what I really want this evening to be for those of us who are gathered here is equipping and enabling us to then act in response. What are some of the things that we can do? So David, I would love for you to share with us some of your reflections and examples of ways that you've engaged politically and with activism around this area of tax justice. Thanks, David.
Okay, thanks, Matt. And Yeah, just reflecting on what you were just saying. I think in terms of for activists, good slogans kept repeating are a good thing. And yeah, there is plenty of money in this country. It's just in the wrong places. And to keep saying that to people or in conversation is one of the way of getting the messages across. And the other one is people are talking about tax as a burden, and we were trying to get through Just Money movement the concept that tax is a blessing, not a burden, because of all the good things that it does. And to keep sending out those little messages, because I do remember doing an interview with one radio announcer, radio presenter, it was local radio, and just about this issue, and just saying, I love tax, I love paying tax. And he was silent for about 20 seconds. I've never managed to silence, but those kind of messages are well worth trying to repeat, even in supposedly sympathetic circles. I mean, in activism, and I suspect here there's a lot of people I see on the screen who are well experienced in these matters, and I don't want to be accused too much of teaching grandmothers and grandfathers to suck eggs here, but it depends a bit where you are. I mean, I was in London for 35 years, and there's so many more opportunities for activists and for doing things in London, and now being in deepest Worcestershire for 15, 16 years. It's tough, and it depends a bit where you are as to how you approach these things. However, I do think the local level is really important, and it's about changing the wind in society as to which direction society should be going in, and that's needed, and even in little towns like Evesham, as well as it's in the big city. So if you're starting this game, it's looking for something that can engage people. For instance, a speaker meeting at local level on tax justice, or we did one in Worcester, for example. We got the then coordinator of what was then Church Action on Tax Justice, Justin Thacker, to come and speak, and he was had a polished presentation. But then we also got Lynn Denham, who was a councillor and subsequently leader of Worcester City Council, to speak as well, in a church context, and that brought people together. And from that, quite a bit of useful work developed. Similarly, in Birmingham, we went and worked with the Quakers to get a meeting where Andrew Mitchell MP came to speak as co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group. He was willing to do that because the Quakers were involved. It wasn't just a small activist group. And that's the issue of building coalitions when you're trying to initiate something. Always look for similar parties who can work with and have got sympathy. We had a Zoom meeting. It was on Zoom because the Archbishop of Birmingham said he would, Catholic Archbishop said he would contribute and share with us, but he wasn't going to come out to any meeting. But yes, if we did a Zoom meeting, which is now possible these days, then he would contribute. Although by and large, Zoom prevents the kind of personal communication and chemistry which enables groups to get going if you can gather people for a meeting, but it can be used as another tool, as it were, in the bag. Films are a good thing to attract people. Show a film in a community building or a church. I remember Christian Aid some time ago had this film, I forget the full title now, something about gold, and it was about William Taylor, who was a priest in the City of London and worked on exposing the corruption really in the City of London. He was a councillor of the City of London, got into trouble for that and really got squeezed out in the end. But the films are missing a bit in these days, so that's just throwing out an idea that maybe we could get some sympathetic filmmakers to do a film on the current debates in tax, because that would be a valuable way of drawing people in, attracting people. They'll come and watch a film. But always, if you have a meeting or a speaker meeting or a film, you have a target, you have an action which should come out of that. And that can be the basic things of letters to MPs, which are always important, not to denigrate those. And you have a template to give people, or you have a petition to sign, and either they can sign it on the spot, you say, yes, this is what we're going to do with it, or you give people sheets and say, take it away, please get other people to sign it and bring it back. Give them a time limit, as it were, otherwise the thing drifts on. But always have an action to come out, an event that you try and organise. And petitions can also be used at street events. If there's a particular thing in the public arena at the moment, capitalise on that. I remember even at Levesham, when it was announced that bankers' bonuses were being allowed again, as happened recently as well. Also, we even got a little demonstration at Ban Bankers' Bonuses, got our placards out, and got a little handout sheet to pass around to people, and stood outside HSBC and then about Santander, which was across the way. And only 4 of us, but people do that. It gets into people's consciousness. Why would we be doing things like that? It begins to change the wind. So every small action, I think, is important. And you can, of course, have a petition and say, yeah, well, if you think we should ban bankers' bonuses, sign here, please. We're going to put that up to our MP, and MPs will respond. In the West Midlands group of the Champions group in West Midlands, we're in correspondence with about 5 local MPs, people of different parts of the group, who are pressing them from about every couple of months on tax. This is what you should do now. This is the top of our agenda now. So those kind of things, do have a spin-off of effect. And you can make your petitions national to government ministers or to the MP, or indeed, if you're dealing with banks, to bank chairmen, because I think we perhaps need to target the banks in the tax justice campaigning a bit more than we have done. They do facilitate, there's no doubt about it, offloading money through the tax havens, and although they all deny and say they've got rules to stop this and that and the other, they're part of the system. They're certainly part of that systemic corruption in the City of London, if you like, which leads to the sort of figures that we heard from just before about the amount of money that gets out through tax dodging, we call it. The argument, tax evasion, tax avoidance, is tax dodging. That's the key word, I think, and key slogan in that particular respect. And you can pick it, and that's why banks are a good target, because banks in most places, although I have to say, sadly for us in Evesham, Barclays cleared off recently, so that will be one of our key targets, particularly in context of the Palestine situation, because they're quite involved there. And we were going to have a picket that said, Barclays, you cleared out of Evesham, now clear out of Palestine, kind of thing. But thinking about seizing the moment, as it were, on what would be a good campaign at a particular point. And picketing, you have your placards, you have your slogans. I remember we did Cadbury's 4 or 5 years ago in West Midlands, the Birmingham network, because Cadbury's were shown to be not paying their taxes. They got a kind of buyout by Mondelez, which they raised money on loans, and then Cadbury's had to pay them back the loans, and therefore, of course, couldn't afford to pay any taxes because all their profits were going back to Mondelez to pay off the loan that Mondelez had taken out. And trying to explain that, and we did get talking to some workers and some of the trade unions, and they didn't know how this all worked. So that again was an opportunity to change the wind a bit. I mean, in the whole research is really important to back up activism, and we usually do rely on Tax Justice UK, whose research is very good, or the Tax Justice Network, or indeed the Fair Tax Foundation, Fair Tax Mark, not forget them, because they're key part of Tax Justice Week. We target mostly the political targets, but we do need to diversify, I think, and address big business, and particularly the banks, more vigorously. Seizing the time, coming back to that slogan, the rich list, it comes out, as Jake was indicating earlier, but it comes out in April every year, and I think we should be planning already for April 2026 how we're going to really have a go at the rich in that particular occasion, and because that's a key point of the year to pick up on that issue. And as again, Jake, Hannah too indicated, patriotic millionaires, good research, good report out today showing that actually the rich don't clear off when their taxes go up, which they can mostly afford them. And there's another little slogan. I remember it was the comedian Mark Steele, I think, who produced a set of badges when this issue arose 2 or 3 years ago, but it was saying, "I will drive you to the airport." So you wear this badge and people say, what's that badge for? And it's about these rich people who say they're going to leave the country if we tax them more. Well, we'll drive them to the airport, because actually they don't usually contribute much to the economy at all, because they just spend it on luxury goods. So it's creating those kind of discussions and debates and so on. If we're doing the stuff, do build your coalitions. At the moment, there's a good, strong coalition between tax justice campaigners and the fossil fuel campaigners, and Jake made some reference to that in terms of how we build those two things together, because we need more taxes in order to phase out fossil fuels and build the renewables to take their place. So they're always a good target for partnership if you want to do something at local level. Shareholder action is another route for activism, and some of you, I think, way back were in part of the anti-apartheid movement, and like many others, I got small numbers of shares in Barclays, and it was Midland Bank then, now HSBC, Standard Chartered, Shell, GEC, and so on. I've still got my HSBC now and Barclays shares, and can still go to the company meetings and ask the questions, and did that recently at both HSBC, which is a hybrid meeting, so you go online, you can still get to the meetings more easily, in a sense, on that route, or the Barclays meeting was in person, and this time I was raising stuff about Palestine. For both of them were involved in that, but also there were other people on fossil fuels and on the tax-related issues asking those questions. Not difficult. You have to put a bit of a brave face on, but it's worth doing. And you sometimes you can ask, and you want to meet the chairman, or want to meet the director, or who's responsible for this policy. Can we meet them? And you ask them in public. It's very difficult to say, no, we're not going to meet you. They normally would be polite and say yes, and it gives you a way in to engaging with them more actively. A good tactic with AGMs is to get celebrities to be willing to come and speak. Sorry. they don't need a share, and you can name them as a proxy for your share, or 2 shares, or 3 shares, whatever you've got. And we had people like Julie Christie willing to come and speak at Barclays, I remember, when we were running the anti-apartheid movement campaigns and so on. So that's another route to get some visibility. Stunts are a nice bit of activism, and they take some organising, bit of work, but they do generate quite a lot of interest. We created when the anti-apartheid campaigning, we created a piggy bank. This was the End Loans to South Africa campaign. We created a piggy bank in papier-mâché, about sort of 5 feet long and 3 feet high or something, and wheeled it round on a trolley. We had a ringmaster shouting, "Come and see the piggy bank, see how the piggy bank produces." And you would, the person wheeling the piggy bank would put a fistful of pound notes into the piggy bank's mouth as a lend, and then we would retrieve large golden coins out of its backside as it produced the money. And this is what the apartheid system does. You invest in it and you get gold out of it. We did managed to hang a banner over the Methodist Central Hall, because the Midland Bank at that point had a branch as part of the Central Hall, saying Midland End Loans to South Africa kind of thing. It only lasted about half hour till the Central Hall staff got very anxious, but we were fortunate in having cased the joint and found you could actually get onto that balcony fairly easily, and that got a picture in the Times, for instance, the next day. So those kind of stunts are fun. With Midland Bank also, we printed paying in slips and put them in local branches, saying in those days, when people paid into account over the counter, as it were, and these paying slips all said "Don't bank on apartheid," and people were using them. We saw them go in and take out the slip, use them, pay them in, because they were made out just like a paying slip. They just were overprinted with "Don't bank on apartheid." So those kind of stunts are perhaps the fun side, but an important dimension of activism. So just finally, bit of humour about the campaigning, about activism. Always try to make people smile as well as get agitated. Both are necessary. But I don't know if people read it. There was a big piece, a long read in The Guardian today, was about activism and how it's working, and how some kind of activism does alienate some people to some degree, and Just Stop Oil have been going through that kind of debate. Well, I would still support Just Stop Oil and say that was necessary, but also let's look at how you can do it to make people smile as well as get annoyed. That's one element that I'd encourage them to look at for the future. You need passion, you need a real commitment to justice, and that can come from a faith commitment or indeed a humanist commitment. But really, really, we do want justice here, whether it's tax justice or Palestine or climate crisis or whatever. And finally, you need persistence. You've got to keep it up and keep it going. And here I call on the Palestinian or the Arabic word sumud, which the Palestinians use there isn't an English translation, but it's about persistence, it's about endurance, about resilience, about resistance. We all need to be a good campaigner, a good activist. You need sumud. And it's a good time for tax justice activism. It's really come on over the last 10 years, and I've seen that really, really develop. So do something if you're not already, and I think many of you are, but do something. Watch your sweet spot, as it were. Seize the time, because now is a very good time to act. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, David. I think there was a lot of wisdom in there, from getting to know your local context, building relationships with others nearby that you can work with for power. And I particularly like the kind of humor and creativity side of that as well. That was really great. I'd love to invite all of our panelists back to be spotlighted, and we're just going to have about 15 minutes now for Q&A. And thank you so much to everyone. There's been a really engaging and stimulating conversation happening in the chat already. I've tried my best to collate as many of those as I can on my document off to the side here. I will probably have to combine some of those questions, so I'll try and do my best to do justice to what you've asked. But if anyone has any more questions they want to add, please feel free to put them in the chat. I can't guarantee we'll get to them. So I'll encourage the panel to be concise and to the point in their answers as best they can. But given the groupings that I've got together here, I think I'm going to start with a bit of a question around narrative. So there were a couple of comments, one from Stella saying, how can the government improve the public relations of tax, particularly looking ahead to the next election all the time, if they're only ever thinking about it in terms of what's going to win me votes? Are they just going to kind of race to the bottom, not tell the public the truth, etc.? I'm reading between the lines of Stella's question there, sorry. And then Becky's comment as well, where she says, I think we're very blessed to have a welfare state in the UK. It reassures me to know my taxes are helping to protect our most vulnerable. But how do we encourage everyone to think like this? Even good Christians I know moan about paying their taxes. So 2 comments there about kind of framing, persuasion, making the argument for this. Would anyone like to jump in with some thoughts on how we might approach that narrative piece?
Yeah, I can have a go at that. I think if there was $1 million answer, then we need to have this conversation. But I think it is around pointing to what your tax pays for. I think we all know that really intrinsically. We all kind of recognise that, but actually when it's laid out that things like potholes, things like the NHS, it goes the whole kind of gamut of life. And I think pointing out that your tax, when the government of any colour, right, are increasing tax, they're not normally doing it on a whim, they're not normally doing it, or even when they're charging tax at all, it's not normally done on a whim, it's done with a view to investing in public services, investing in things that make life better. And I think actually bringing that to a really small level is something that I think we maybe could do better in our political narrative, that it's not just your taxes fund the NHS, which is this massive kind of thing which we all interact with, but actually is a little bit too big to get our heads around in some way. I think it's really striking that like at the last election last year, one of the most popular campaigns or manifesto promises, sorry, was the one around potholes. So when I was out on the doorstep saying to people, do you know that potholes cost you on average £200 a year because that's the cost of a catalytic converter. Labour are going to address those potholes, and actually that's because everyone drives on our roads, right? If you say we're going to fund the NHS, some people go private. The school system, all of those, there's privatisation. You can't avoid driving on roads, and if they're full of potholes, then absolutely everyone experiences that. And I think there was something really wise in that, something really bringing it to a really, a pothole is a small thing compared to the NHS, but I think actually pointing out that the really small, seemingly trivial things of life are paid for by taxes as well, is probably some other way to go. So the Thanks for Tax campaign that JustMoney did last year, I think, got people to say things that they were proud that their tax paid for, or that they were glad that their taxes paid for. And I know some of the answers on that went from lampposts right up to the NHS. And I think maybe we've made the argument that your taxes fund public services at the big scale. Actually, some of the work is to be done at reminding people that it's the small things that you notice on a day-to-day basis when they're not there, that maybe we can focus on as well.
So you go for it.
What I would like our government or anybody who speaks about tax publicly to do is to de-link this idea that tax is what provides government with the money to spend, because that's not how it works at all. And it is absolutely frustrating to hear people who should know better, including Rachel Reeves, get up publicly and say we can only spend what we bring in. In other words, the taxes you give us. Taxes are a way of recouping government spending. If there was no government spending, none of us would have any money to pay taxes with. And so I think that our public people in media and also anyone who represents an elected figure ought to try and persuade them to read a bit about modern monetary theory and to understand a little bit more about how the economy works in these modern times. It never did work like a piggy bank, ever, ever, ever. And Margaret Thatcher is to blame for linking it to household budgets, because that is just not the way you run a nation. And I would like to see that first and obvious myth debunked before anything else.
Jake.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And a very important part is that, so much of what we can be doing is investing. If you're only going to spend money that's, suddenly mapped out of tax revenue, we wouldn't have the NHS. The government was, recovering from the war and, chose to create the welfare state. We are all far, far better off for it. So I agree with Sue's point there. One other kind of final point I would say on it is also around two things. One, the language of universalism. I think the question of empathy in this country is so vital. We're looking at disability cuts. Soon that the Labour government are looking to implement a PIP. Some people aren't really too focused on it, but actually our social security system is there for all of us when we need it. And just because you might not need a service today does not mean that you might not need it tomorrow or next month or next year. And so it's really important that we defend, and when we talk about these things, is that they are there for everyone should you need it. Not just obviously what it pays for, as Hannah was saying. And the final point is also just on fairness. I think when I think the comment around people griping about having to pay their taxes, some people have a right to be a bit angry, right? That they're paying essentially the same marginal tax rate as hedge fund managers. There was a story a few years ago where Rishi Sunak was paying the same marginal tax rate as a nurse. And that is completely unjust. And that is because income from wealth is taxed far less from income from work. So we need to be equalising capital gains tax. We need to be implementing with income tax. We need to be, having a wealth tax and so on. And actually, the government also needs to be investing in HMRC to go after the super rich tax cheats, because their tax affairs are more complex. And we actually just put out a video, I'll just show the LinkedIn link there, around this, in that for every pound invested to go after the super wealthy in terms of tax avoidance, we received 14 back last year. We brought in 5.2 billion into the public purse for an investment of 350 million pounds. So that is also something that we need to be pursuing as well. So there's a question of fairness.
Thanks, Jake. Just before we move on from the subject of kind of framing and narrative, Olaf's put in a fantastic question in the chat that I'd like for us to touch on quickly before we move on to other areas. Is there a concerted effort to be pragmatic and get the low-hanging fruit first, in the sense of taking on the battles that are easier and simpler to win, weighted to significance, rather than doing complex changes to the system first so that progress can be made? So it's a question about tactics, it's a question about politics. Does anybody want to jump in?
I do, because Jake's just raised it, because he's talked about making tax rates equivalent across tax on income and tax on capital gains or dividends. That's a very, very straightforward step. Richard Murphy, who writes a blog, Funding the Future, Richard is always annotating the costs of different initiatives to increase the tax take. And this is a straightforward action that would raise about 10 billion to make equivalent the capital gains that somebody pays if they sell assets, shares, property, whatever, with the marginal tax rate that they pay. So the highest rate of tax that they pay. And that would have changed Rishi Sunak's tax bill considerably.
Sounds like a resounding yes from Sue. Okay, I'm going to move us on now to what I've grouped together as more kind of practical questions. And I think we might potentially be leaning a fair amount on Jake with some of these, so get yourself ready. But there were a lot of interesting discussions in the chat around a couple of specific points. So one is around the example of wealth taxes in other countries. which have been said to have maybe failed on their own terms, not raised enough money. What can we learn from that? And then I guess there's also a point around kind of individuals. Do individuals move when they're taxed too highly? Do they move their money without moving? How can we effectively stop that wealth from avoiding the taxation that should be paid upon it? So thank you to Robert and Andrew and Kieran and all others who've asked those questions. Yeah, somebody like to respond?
I'm happy to jump in. So, 3 countries levy net wealth taxes in Europe: Norway, Spain, and Switzerland. Spain was implemented in 2011. France and Italy levy wealth taxes on selected assets, but not on an individual's net wealth per se. France's wealth tax is often used as an example of why wealth taxes just don't work, and it was in place until about 2017, replaced with a similar tax on property, but not business or shares. It raised, I think, about 5 billion euros in 2015, but the policy in France is very different to what is being proposed here. That threshold was essentially with households with assets of 1.3 million, in excess of 1.3 million euros, which is an incredibly low threshold. It's essentially applied, I think, to 343,000 people. And what we are proposing as a 2% on 10 million pounds would apply to just 20,000 people. So it's far less complex. And also costly for HMRC to administer, and setting a high threshold allows exemptions to be limited, whereas in France, kind of badly designed loopholes enable avoidance. So, at 10 million pounds, someone will have a diversity of assets. They will have maybe multiple properties. They'll have income from stocks, shares, dividends, things like that. And they'll also have, other kind of assets, maybe a jet, maybe yachts, so on and so forth. So, sorry, I'm just getting a bit of feedback. Is anyone else getting that? Sorry, thank you. I think someone was just unmuted. So there's a question that obviously is around the policy design. And then I think the other part of the question was having people move. And so, I think Patriotic Millionaires do a lot of great work on this. I've also shared in the chat earlier a new report out from the Tax Justice Network, ourselves, and Patriotic Millionaires, tackling that essentially the media sensationalized a report based off bogus methodology, that shows that actually people move for very many reasons. And actually, you're seeing a group of people, dare I mention the name Trump on a call like this, called the Donald Dashers, who are leaving the US because their values do not align with Donald Trump's and the leader of their country. So the UK remains a very attractive place to be, and people, they have their families here, they have their businesses here, they have their assets here, and there are other things you can do. Land doesn't move. There's lots of conversations about implementing a land value tax as well. And crucially, it's where people may move. Their businesses are here. We need to be addressing corporation tax and profit shifting. I've mentioned that in the chat as well, in terms of public country by country reporting. And we also need to look at things like an exit tax for people who have a business here and want to move abroad and sell up and to avoid paying tax. And we're actually, along with Italy, one of 2 countries that don't have an exit tax in the G7. So lots of ways to tackle that. Did I miss any particular questions, or is that okay? I'll also put my email in the chat, because I appreciate this is not such a short amount of time and we could probably talk a lot longer. And I'm happy for anyone to reach out.
Yes, I was about to say, sadly, we do not have the time to address all these points in sufficient detail, which is a great shame. But yeah, please do share. Please do get in touch with Jake if you have further questions, or with us at Just Money. I'll share some details later on in a second, but really do appreciate the detailed engagement on that. Just finally, to close off our Q&A, I'd like to take us back to where we started this evening, to theology. So theologians and amateur theologians in the room, this is for you. Early on, Kieran asked the question, does anyone think a Leviticus-style complete wealth redistribution could equal things up, provide a passive income for ordinary people and world-class public services? So I believe Kieran is referring there to the Jubilee laws in Leviticus, which redistributed wealth and prevented anyone from getting too rich and anyone from getting too poor by returning land to the families it was originally owned to as the kind of primary source of wealth. As a very quick explainer as to what that law was intended to do. So you can correct me if you're looking quizzical there. But yeah, what can we maybe learn from those principles in the Old Testament law for society today, if that's at all possible? Big question.
It's a massive question, but I think it is the right one to be asking. So I've done a whole load of work on economic inequality and theology with a slightly different hat on. And I think one of the really encouraging things actually that I see in that is that there's a historical precedent that actually the Old Testament, the Jubilee, some of the principles that are there are historical and are things that were done in a real time and place in history, regardless of whether you attach any kind of theological importance to the Old Testament and stuff, which obviously many of us on this call do, but actually they're not just theological principles, they are historical realities and an inspiration of a time and a place where an economy worked slightly differently, not perfectly, but slightly differently than the one we're living in now. So maybe that inspiration that it's been done before, and it is possible to get there again, we hope.
David, go for it.
Yeah, I can't slip in just before, and one of the things I left out in activism, I'd said enough, but Sue reminds me this business of the myth of how the tax system works. Do make complaints to the media when you hear politicians or indeed presenters in many cases stating these things as if they're patently obvious. And it's easy to make complaints to the BBC. It's easy to write short letters to the newspapers. Don't let them get away with these myths that they will repeat indefinitely if we let them.
So I'm just going to say one short thing. The interesting thing about the Jubilee regulations or suggestions or parameters or whatever you want to call them, despite the fact that they may never have been fully carried out, was that they set an ideal and they laid out an understanding that a human society doesn't work well when people can be plunged into endless, deeply cycling poverty, debt, slavery, all that, lose their land. One of the important parts of the Jubilee one of the important parts of the Jubilee enactments was restoration, that people were taken from situations of difficulty and restored back to a position where they could be, again, not quite self-sufficient, but sufficient. They could earn their own living. So land was restored. People were freed from debt and freed from slavery. Their situation was changed. And I think as a society, we could start investigating what would be suitable limits on things like rent payments, on things like debts incurred. There's a wonderful book called Sacred Economics by Charles Eisenstein that actually posits that those of us who have got money on deposit, and being a pensioner now, that's quite important to me, but that what we should expect is that the interest rate, instead of going up all the time, should actually go down the longer we have that money on deposit, in order to sort of bring us to face the fact that everything we live within is constructed out of debt, and that binds people in ways that are unacceptable. And we need, like the manna in the wilderness, to put limits on what we can acquire, accumulate, and hoard.
Thank you, Sue. We are rapidly running out of time. I just want to draw attention to what Jake's put in the chat there, which I was about to mention actually, so thank you for linking. Our friends at the New Economics Foundation have been exploring some really interesting work around the idea of an extreme wealth line, like an extreme poverty line. How do we understand when wealth becomes harmful to society? Also, other organizations
quite early
engaging with this idea, like the Fairness Foundation, have done some really good research into the risks of extreme wealth as well. So do check that out if you're interested in some of our secular allies who are kind of exploring, I guess, rhyming ideas to that. But Anyway, for now, it falls to me to say an enormous thank you to our 4 contributors, Sue Richardson, Jake Atkinson, Hannah Rich, and David Haslam. We've really valued your contributions this evening, and I hope that it's been helpful for those of you who are attending. Just briefly before we close the meeting, I'd love to share a few opportunities of next steps to get involved, what you can do in response to what you've heard today. So just bear with me one moment whilst I share my screen, and I'll have a couple of opportunities to share with us. Firstly, if you're new to the Just Money movement, you've not been involved with us before, then please do consider signing up to our newsletter. This is where you can hear all the latest news, what we're doing as an organization. We don't just work on tax. We also engage with the financial sector. We help churches to bank ethically. There's an awful lot going on. So if you'd like to hear more from us, and you don't have to be a person of faith to be on our newsletter, please do visit that link, justmoney.org.uk/join-in, or scan the QR code on the screen. And we're also on pretty much every social media platform. You can find us at JustMoneyMVT. And this session has been part of our quarterly Just Money Champions training session. And I don't have loads of time to explain that now, but champions get access to a network of activists who are pursuing our vision for a fairer, greener future. And we put on training sessions like this one every 3 months, send over resources, regular emails, connect people to each other for opportunities for action. So if something's kind of lit a spark in you this evening and you think I'd love to get more involved in this agenda, then signing up as a champion is a really great place to put some of your time and energy. So again, justmoney.org.uk/champions, or scan this QR code if you're able to use that. I know sometimes it's tricky. All of this information will be in an email we send out after the event, and I think Annie might be putting them in the chat now. Anyway. The very next thing we're doing with our champions is this week on Friday, which is Champions Connect, a very informal open space to get to meet other champions. We'll talk about something in the news, we'll reflect on a passage of scripture, and we'll pray together about what's going on in the world. So if you're around on Friday lunchtime, then please do join us for that. And finally, as I said earlier, around the comprehensive spending review statement tomorrow, we will be publishing a statement tomorrow. Watch out on our social media and our website for that to be published. And we'll be calling on our supporters to use our very simple Write to Your MP tool, which you can put your postcode in and it will generate your MP and give you an email that you can send to them asking them to explore options to tax wealth instead of making cuts to public services. We've got a template email there. You're welcome to go in there and edit it, add in locally relevant things, add in your own motivations, make it authentic to your voice. But also, if you want to do something that's really easy and only takes a couple of minutes, then you can also visit that link, either at that QR code or I think in the link at the chat as well. That's everything I have to plug. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. Please do feel free to get in touch with us at Just Money. You can email info@justmoney.org.uk or get in touch with us on social media or our website. Jake's also shared his email address. Thank you. Check out Christians on the Left as well if you're interested. But for now, have a fantastic rest of your evening, and thank you for joining us.